Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioural change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioural experts across industries and organisations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviourist, Nick Hobson.
Hello, BS listeners. I want to officially welcome you to the Season 2 premiere of the BS Podcast. And I am thrilled to kick us off with our first guest of the second season, Professor CASS Sunstein from Harvard University. CASS is the founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy at Harvard Law School. In 2018, he received the Holberg Prize from the government of Norway, sometimes described as the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for law and the humanities. From 2009 to 2012, he was administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, and after that, he served on the President's Review Board on Intelligence and Communications Technologies and on the Pentagon's Defense Innovation Board. CASS has testified before congressional committees on many subjects, and he has advised officials at the United Nations, the European Commission, the World Bank, and many nations on issues of law and public policy. He also serves as an advisor to the Behavioural Insights Team in the UK. CASS is, of course, the author of hundreds of articles and dozens of books, including Nudge, along with Rich Thaler, Simpler, The Ethics of Influence, Republic, Impeachment, A Citizen's Guide, The Cost-Benefit Revolution, On Freedom, Conformity, How Change Happens, and Too Much Information. Side comment here from myself. If you were counting, that is, if my math is right, 7 books in the last 3 or 4 years. So it's quite impressive. CASS is now working on a variety of projects involving the regulatory state, sludge, fake news, and freedom of speech. CASS, welcome to the show.
A great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
So as I prep for our call, and I said to you before I hit record, I didn't want to do too much, but I reached a point where when I was in that prep, I think I was in some sort of weird flow state where my notes just sort of kept adding to the page, and my list of questions was growing and growing. And if I went with that, I think we would have ended up in a day-long interview, which of course we're not going to do. So I decided I broke my flow and I came back to reality. I whittled down that list of questions and I focused on a select few topics and themes. And how I landed on that was, I think some of those questions are going to be relevant to the current realities that we're finding ourselves in these days. Others, rather selfishly, are some burning questions that I've always thought about since my early days of training as a social psychologist. And then some, undoubtedly, listeners will want to know more about and hearing your thoughts. So I figure we can start with How Change Happens, one of your more recent works. And if you'll humor me and listeners, maybe a bit of a trip down memory lane, starting back in 2008 with your book along with Richard Nudge. So first question for you is, just reading the works and of course following you for many years, it seems like there's this move from the individual to the collective. Behavioral insights and behavioral economics was very much about the psychology of individual change, especially with Nudge and Ariely's work. And it seems now, along with your work, How Change Happens, there's this recent trend that's moving from the change of psychology, like sort of psychology change, to sociology change. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that shift and why it's the case that it's happening now. I know there's always the perennial debate between the sociologists and the psychologists, but I'm just curious to hear what you think. Does change happen at the individual, or does change happen at the group?
Well, my own training is as a lawyer, and lawyers tend to think in terms of institutions and constitutions and legislatures and administrative agencies. That's where the lawyer's mind often goes. In terms of behavioral science and change, I think there isn't a shift so much as different people's interests go in different places depending on what's happening in the world and depending on what's happening in interesting research. So I was intrigued around the same time I started working with Thaler, actually, maybe in some ways before, with the idea of informational cascades, which is about how social learning often causes very rapid shifts
Mm,
in directions that reflect the information held by very few people. So people can get very excited about music or get very convinced about some medical uh, finding, which may not be really a reliable finding, or can be very scared of a danger or very relaxed about a danger, just because they're learning from one another. And that's really at the collective level. It often interacts with individual biases. So if the availability heuristic is leading people to get really frightened about things that have a low probability of happening, then that can work with social influences to create what Timur Kuran and I, in the paper I'm thinking of, called availability cascades,
mhm.
just the individual and the social interacting with each other. I think it is the case that as behaviorally interested scholars and practitioners have applied their work to policies, including the policies of private institutions like Facebook or Coca-Cola, um, the what happens at the collective level is often really interesting. I'm in some ways a student of Jan Elster, a Norwegian political theorist, philosopher, not literally a student, but when I was a kid law professor at Chicago, he was one of my heroes. He was at
Mm,
Chicago also at the time. And he embraced, I think, convincingly methodological individualism,
mm,
by which he meant only you can't explain social phenomena except by reference to what individuals do. And I think that's correct. So
mm.
the 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 kind of little term that was used then, to some extent used now, is micro foundations. So if we think about group behavior, whether people are all wearing masks or really worried about climate change or getting interested in white supremacy or thinking that democracy is on its last legs, the best accounts all ultimately, I think, point to what individuals think and do.
Yeah, and as I'm just in my own training, I'm of course biased, and I lean more towards the individual. And I suspect that when with nudge and predictably irrational and thinking fast and slow, which then led to all the uh, different nudge units like bit and others around the world, and then in the last few years that moved from policy to the for-profit sector, which is a sort of my world as behavioral practitioners in management consulting. There was this clear over anchoring on the individual, on the psychology, on the behavioral science, in particular on the science part. And this is just having conversations with other practitioners. There was this what was heavily discounted were the other related fields, whether there's anthropology and or sociology, and their use of more qualitative research methods like focus groups. Those were sort of scoffed at because they weren't they weren't science. There was no randomized controlled trial. There was no experimental test. But I see the pendulum swinging back now, where a lot of the behavioral insights work, whether in policy or for profit, is this blend, is really this hitting on this balance between if we can map it on this way, like the individual and the behavioral science or behavioral economics, and the collective, which is perhaps more of the broader social influences, which we can learn tons of from the folks in sociology and anthropology.
I, I want to be cautious about that. So I think
Hmm.
so the everything depends on what you're trying to figure out, of course. But if the question is, suppose Coca-Cola wants to sell more diet drinks and fewer full sugar, full calorie drinks, um, randomized controlled trials are really good at figuring out what strategies work and what don't. I worked in the US government, as you mentioned, for a number of years, and I still have um, friendly relations with former colleagues and friends in the US and other governments. And there's been a very strong move away from focus groups. on the ground that the knowledge you get might be um, not ready for use in policy.
Hmm.
So if you're trying to figure out what kind of label to put on, let's say, automobiles, so that people, let's say, make informed choices about the environment or about economic savings, focus groups are highly unreliable.
Hmm.
So I think if you want to learn about, you know, things that anthropologists study, uh, you should consult anthropologists. They'll tell you that. If you want to learn whether a label is effective or whether automatic enrollment in, let's say, an anti poverty program is going to have a significant effect or a good effect, um, I'd be reluctant to go right to the anthropologists on that. I'd
Hmm.
be very reluctant to go to the economists on the things that anthropologists typically study. Focus groups are not useless, but a presumption of uselessness is not the worst thing to begin with if you are, um, you know, I think consulting with a large company or if you are working with a government. Presumption can be overcome, and a focus group will often tell you things that you don't know. So better focus group than nothing. But if the question is what effect will an intervention have, I'd be very cautious about giving focus groups pride of place.
Yeah, good. And when you and Thaler wrote Nudge, or I'm sure there was a lot of interesting thinking and discussions that preceded the actual writing of the book. As you see the movement from policy to management and organizations in the for-profit sector, are you surprised to see that shift, or did you predict that it would happen in the way that it did?
You know, what was really fun about working on the project, and it began actually with um, two academic articles, one an economics article called Libertarian Paternalism, and one a law review article called Libertarian Paternalism is Not an Oxymoron. Actually, years before that, we wrote a paper on a behavioral approach to law and economics where we talked about paternalism. And what we were really interested in was trying to figure something out and whether it would have an impact uh, was, kind of a fifth order consideration. Uh, by the time we were done, we thought we hoped someone would read it, but the focus was really on trying to figure out uh, what tools that maintain freedom of choice, but that give, let's say, health and financial well-being the benefit of the doubt. What tools are there, and when might they work?
Hmm.
We were kind of on fire with curiosity um, uh, and uh, and a quest to figure it out.
Hmm.
Uh, since the book was published, it's now over 10 years. Both of us have been absolutely amazed at the creativity and ingenuity of countless people in India or uh, the United Kingdom or Canada or um, Mexico, who Argentina, where I was not long ago, who've used the ideas in ways that we couldn't possibly have anticipated, and certainly in the business community. Um, whether it's to engagement with employees to try to increase productivity or um, well-being, or whether it's trying to help investors to make better choices. If you're, a company whose job it is to help investors make better choices, especially
Hmm.
in a chaotic market. And so sometimes I've seen in airports when one used to go to airports, huge posters from companies saying, we're here to help you, and then there's going to be a list. There's a list of behavioral biases.
Hmm.
uh, so that's been amazing to me, and the kind of clarity of thought and exposition on the part of private sector entities, sometimes trying to do good for the world, sometimes trying to do good for themselves,
Hmm.
frequently trying to do both. And that's just completely inspiring to see.
And I mean, you probably get this all the time, or you probably hear it from multiple people. But a lot of the past guests on the show, they don't necessarily have a formal like graduate school training, or they're not a PhD in behavioral economics or social psychologists. Very often, they are what we call as behavioral enthusiasts, and maybe they had a psych undergrad degree, and then they went into industry in the working world, and they landed in marketing or product product design, product development, or user experience. And it was just sort of timing was perfect, where maybe they graduated from their undergraduate in like 2005, and they did a few years, and then Nudge and Predictably Irrational, and these books came out. And what they say to me every single time is, they would say, I had these thoughts, just like sort of layperson thoughts, and I would have these intuitions of how people make certain decisions, but I didn't necessarily have the language, or I didn't have the nomenclature or the framework. So when these books came out, and when your works made it to the public sphere, it just opened up a floodgate, a good floodgate,
Yeah,
for
completely.
people to start thinking and using that in a more systematic way.
I'm completely smiling because you're describing my brothers and sisters. I was English major in college, and then I went to law school, and then I ended up at the University of Chicago, where rational actor models were dominant, and they
Hmm.
were used by completely amazing people. And as a skeptic, I was clueless. I thought this was not the full picture, the rational actor model, though it was deployed by people who got Nobel Prizes and have done completely path-breaking work. But I discovered Kahneman and Tversky, and uh, the first article actually by Thaler. And so I had exactly the experience you're describing, not by virtue of reading a popular book, but by virtue of reading Kahneman, Thaler, Kahneman and Tversky on prospect theory, and then
Hmm.
heuristics and biases, and it was like a light bulb exploded in the head. And it's exactly what you're saying, that intuitions got a structure as a
Mm-hmm.
result of this work. What Kahneman Tversky focused on was the human mind, of course. They weren't focused, at least principally, uh, on policy or on companies and how they might do better. That that took a while, but the foundations they laid by, uh, at least as a first approximation, getting clear on what people actually are like.
Hmm. Hmm. And not surprising, these conversations quite often, more often than not, lead to questions of ethics, and often present these ethical dilemmas. And it's sort of my favorite part of the whole field, really, especially with the earlier work on libertarian paternalism. So you've been quoted, I believe, and feel free to fact check this if it's not actually true, because the internet is a weird place, um, saying that when it comes to political and social matters, quote, the issues that most divide us are fundamentally about facts rather than values.
That's an
Can you elaborate a little on that?
Okay, so this grew out of my experience actually in the White House, where I noticed that in a time, and we're very much still in it, in which Republicans and Democrats are split, uh, if it turns out that an occupational safety and health regulation is going to save 1,000 workers from dying, and it's only going to cost, let's say, $20 million, Republicans like it. They really like it. And the division between Democrats and Republicans, or the left and right, melts away if you say, do you want to save 1,000 human lives for a few $1 million? Everyone says
Hmm.
yes. Or if you have an environmental regulation, let's say it involves clean air, where it will have an extremely modest effect on public health, not none, but really modest, and it's going to cost, let's say, 40 $1 billion over a certain period. No one's going to like, almost no one's going to like that. At least
Hmm.
no one I saw in the political domain. So what I observe time and again is that whether the issue involves worker safety or transportation or immigration, even, or uh, clean air or climate change, that if there was clarity on the facts, the values seemed like background noise. They weren't really
Hmm.
very interesting to people. Now, of course, people's values influence their judgments about how to resolve factual uncertainty. So it might be if you're left of center, you'll be more sympathetic to the claim that climate change is a really serious problem than if you're the right of center. That's completely fair. But what is a path forward, and what is really driving the underlying disagreement, is a statement of what the facts are. Now, immigration I gave with some fear and trembling, because that's the hardest one in my little list. There's some people who just, are very cautious about immigration and would assert that their caution has to do with values and not facts.
Hmm.
Even so, I saw time and again, you know, immigration policies that if you had agreement that they would lead to economic growth and wouldn't displace American workers and would give people, uh, access to our country and also access for employers to people who do good jobs, then people would say, okay, that's a good program. And if people who are favorable to immigration see that, as a matter of fact, this particular initiative will lead to a bunch of people here who are going to engage in violent acts and aren't going to be contributing to the economy and are not going to be productive citizens in any way, then pro immigration forces think, well, that's not a very good policy. We shouldn't do that anymore.
Hmm.
And so the claim, and I realize, I came to it uh, late myself, and I realize it's jarring. And it's not always true on questions like abortion or gun control. There's certain abortion, particularly gun control, it's actually harder. But on abortion, if you think that uh, fetuses are human beings, then that's going to drive your judgment. And if you don't think that, then that will at least help drive your judgment. But on so much, if we get agreement on facts, then we're golden. And it happens every day. It doesn't get in the newspaper just
Hmm.
because it's so golden.
Hmm. So interesting. The value disagreements, which are happening all the time, um, whether at the level of policy or just your individual citizen decision making. So all that disagreement that goes on, all the mudslinging that we're seeing, which seems to be more than ever before, um, that happens before the immersion or the engaging in the facts. So if we assume this like more technocratic approach to decision making in citizenship and in governance, what do you see as the solution to ensure that people are immersing themselves in the facts first before they get swept away by any one set of value judgments?
Okay, so it's a great question, and I'm thinking now a bit about you know actual governments like in Canada or Denmark or the United States or Germany. And these are different governments, but they share a certain characteristic, which is that so much of policymaking is done by people whose business it is to try to figure out what's true. And the noise of political disagreement is a little like a heavy metal band in the background that they're successfully shutting out. Now, uh, it would be, reckless to say that this is always true, ridiculous, and it would be reckless to say it's usually true, though I
Hmm.
think not ridiculous to say that. And I'll give you some examples that they're from a kind of improbable area where uh, uh, public officials in the United States have been kind of systematically reducing administrative and paperwork burdens that people ordinarily face to get food stamps, to get tax benefits, to get health care, to engage
Hmm.
with patients. They've been doing that, not in a very public way, it's not secret, but it's not like on the front page of the newspapers usually. And it's been technical people who've said, under these circumstances, to ask people to come and for an interview, or to ask them to fill out 50 pages of forms, or even 15 pages of forms, that has costs and excessive benefits. Let's just waive that or make that much simpler. And this might seem, like small bore stuff, but it can make the difference between severe economic distress and not, and it can make the difference between access to healthcare and not. And this is just an example of things in the last period. But there are policies involving car safety, where an issue which I worked on closely in the government, still have involvement in, where what's happening at the Department of Transportation and in the United States and in the equivalent in the United Kingdom, it's not something where yelling about the wonderfulness or terribleness of President Trump, or the wonderfulness or terribleness of Brexit is even relevant. For ordinary people who are either somewhat interested in politics or keenly interested in politics, um, uh, to immerse oneself in the facts often is very calming. Sometimes not. So climate change is one, and I'll put my cards on the table. I believe
Mhm.
climate change is real, and I believe it's a very serious problem. And immersion in the facts, I believe, leads pretty unambiguously to that conclusion.
Mhm.
But that's not reflective of where the United States is as a country, certainly. And many people who are skeptics about climate change, actually, they know a lot. They're not ignorant.
Mm.
So that's one where the factual assessments have gotten ideologically inflamed. Values are certainly relevant, but kind of backdoor relevant. It's meaning people don't say, because of my values, I think climate change is just fine. That would be front door relevant. The back door relevant is if you are the sort of person, I think, who is very pro free markets, you will be presumptively skeptical about climate change. This is a sociological hypothesis. And
Mm.
if you're the sort of a person who is not that excited about free markets and regulation, is something that you either welcome or are comfortable with, then the climate change problem is one you are going to be very interested in worrying over. Let's put it that
Mhm. So it's almost like whether you whether you like it or not, whether you're aware of it or not, you're going to come in. Let's say an individual comes in with the in 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 best faith to attempt to immerse themselves in the facts. It seems like it's almost impossible for them not to be at least somewhat skewed based on those values. Like they're going to come in with that baggage, with
way.
those values, and they're going to engage with the facts in one particular way. Yeah.
I'd soften it a little bit. So I saw in the US government a lot of people who would think about climate change or about worker safety in a way that gave no clue whether they were left of center or right of center.
Hmm.
And those are my favorites. So I saw people in the Council of Economic Advisors whose economic analysis was completely unpredictable, meaning that it was not ideologically
Mm.
predictable. So
Mm.
they might say, with respect to some proposed policy, this makes no economic sense. It's going to cost a fortune, and the monetizable benefits at least are tiny. And that would be on Monday. And then on Wednesday, they'd say about something which, in ideological terms, was similar, was something, let's say, that the left liked.
Mm.
Then they'd say, then on Monday, they didn't, what the left liked was wrong. And then on Wednesday, what the left liked was completely right,
Mm.
because there's a serious economic harm, which could include, let's say, excess mortality. And the economic cost of reducing the harm was low. Those are the economists, my favorite economists in the US government. And then there were people in the Office of Science and Technology Policy who were exactly the same.
Mm.
They would come to, let's say, a problem involving food safety in a way that showed no impact from whatever their ideological priors were. I happen to know that just one was a very good friend, and he was definitely left of center. But
Mm.
there were a bunch of issues where, on the science, he came out right of center. because that's where the science led him. And I'm sure he votes for the Democrats, but on a bunch of ideas that Democratic-leaning people are drawn to, he says the evidence just isn't there.
Hmm. Do you, that makes me feel better. But do you think that applies to the lay person? It seems like as like the collective body, like not long ago, I don't know, maybe a decade ago, we were more sympathetic to these cost benefit, running these proper cost benefit analyses. Um, it
It's,
seems these days it's less so, and then I'm talking more from like the layperson perspective.
it's,
What do you
it's an
think?
empirical question, isn't it?
Hmm.
First,
Hmm.
what the layperson thinks, and second, trend lines with respect to lay people's thinking. And I'd love to see data on it. So far as I'm aware, there isn't any.
Hmm.
I would speculate with probably excessive confidence that there's such heterogeneity in the world of lay people
Hmm.
that any generalization would be confounded. So there are certainly lay people who think, um, if it involves clean air, I'm very concerned and I want to see protection. And there are lay people who think if it involves climate change, I don't want to hear about that nonsense and I'm not worried. But there are a lot of lay people who think, I don't know a whole lot about particulate matter or about silica. And so silica is in the workplace is a big problem, my view is.
Hmm.
But for, if you don't study this stuff, particulate matter and silica, I wouldn't be at all surprised if a large chunk of lay people would say, I don't really have a particular view. Let's do some work.
Hmm. Part of it, and I'm always harping on this with just conversations with people and clients, is a comfort, a certain familiarity or a comfort with scientific thinking. So I think Neil deGrasse Tyson says this often. Like, you don't have to be a trained scientist to think like a scientist. You can think like a scientist and have skepticism and criticism and the notion of even like devising a hypothesis and sort of, so to say, go out and collect data. Like, I wonder what percentage of, and of course this is an individual difference, which I'm sure could be actually measured and plotted along some sort of normal curve to see what is the extent to which people, the layperson, thinks like a scientist or is open and accepting of thinking like a scientist.
Well, yes. I think as you talk about Kahneman's distinction between system one and system two, where we all have a family of cognitive operations in our mind that is intuitive and rapid. And maybe you can think of it as using rules of thumb as an alternative to cost benefit analysis. And much of the time, those rules of thumb work pretty well. And
Hmm.
then we have a deliberative system. This is not a neurological claim. I'm sorry, it's not a neuroscientific claim.
Hmm.
It's a claim about uh, it's itself a heuristic about how people think. Then
Hmm.
there are people who more deliberatively, especially when the stakes are high, get toward or actually do run some numbers. And with respect to policy questions, the data, I think, roughly supports a distinction between things where tribal membership, and I'm going to clarify what's meant by tribal membership, really matters to people's judgments,
Hmm.
and issues where tribal membership doesn't. So, an issue like gun control or nuclear power or climate change, your self understanding with respect to what tribe you belong to is a powerful determinant of what you think. But with respect to a large assortment of questions, food safety, nanotechnology, um, certain issues of occupational safety, these are all candidates. Uh, Tribal membership doesn't much matter. And there's nice data suggesting that uh, Democrats and Republicans on the second type of issues, the issues where tribal membership doesn't much matter, they're kind of all over the map. There's no ideological inflection to what they think, but that they can be led in a tribal direction if they learn that members of their tribe think one thing rather than another. And
Hmm.
that can be flipped. So if Democrats start to learn that Democrats think, let's say, technology X is great, then they'll like it and Republicans won't. But if you give them under pretty realistic setting a different cue, which is the Republicans like it and Democrats don't, then they'll flip and they take that as a signal, and that can kind of tribalize an issue which formerly wasn't.
That's fascinating. And that actually is a nice sort of lead into on social norms, which is what I studied in PhD, and so obviously a topic that I'm very interested in still as I do current work. So norms, as we know, often are viewed as sort of these stable. They have these stable and enduring qualities associated with them, and they drive much of human sociality, especially when you think of like religious or deeply cultural ones. But then there's the on the other side, there's some that seem to wax and wane, and even those that sort of show a sudden emergence, seemingly out of nowhere. Um, why do you think that these, if we can call them emerging norms, why do you think those are particularly important, and what function do they serve for driving behavior change, say on mass?
Okay, so I'm thinking that a lot of people, including yours truly, are wearing masks in public. And that seems to have become, in many areas, kind of in a heartbeat, uh,
Hmm.
the norm. And it has a quality which many, um, analysts of norms emphasize, which is that a violation incurs social sanctions. And so if you go in many places in the United States now and you're not wearing a mask, people will look at you askance. And that turned into the norm in those places so quickly. So I think there are a few drivers. One, which is not the mass case, but is, I think, um, pervasive, is that people have in their heads a judgment that deviates from existing practice. So it may be that women think sexual harassment, which I experience, women might think, is terrible. But it's around and there's not much I can do about it. And so they may live in accordance with a norm that they despise. Or people may live under, let's say, an authoritarian regime and think this is, not livable really, and
Hmm.
I'm governed by people who are tyrants. But they don't say it even to people they know. They will say it only to people who are their intimates, if them. And that is an unstable situation because it suggests that if you have someone brave enough to say, I don't like this, then others will start to say, me too.
Hmm.
And then you can create a cascade of rebellion. So the fact that the uh, French Revolution was described by Tocqueville, of all people, as a complete surprise. And Lenin, this is even more amazing,
Hmm.
stunned by the success of the Russian Revolution. And the Arab Spring, I can say, I was in the US
Hmm.
government at the time. Our best analysts did not expect this at all.
Hmm.
And that is a tribute to the widespread but invisible quality of social uh, agitation. The phenomenon we're now discussing is preference falsification, by
Hmm.
which people don't state what their actual preferences are. And that means conditions are ripe for change. If people have in their heads a disapproval of an existing norm or practice, then their eyes may light up and their statements and actions may shift dramatically once they're given by someone or some group a kind of permission slip or green light. And
Hmm.
with respect to the civil rights movement for abolition of racial segregation and other civil rights movements involving racial injustice, something exactly like this has happened where people hear the words, I am a man. Men hear those words, which are about, I'm not a inferior. And that gives rise to a movement which can change a country. The feminist movement undoubtedly has this shape, and it's very much in progress. With respect to climate change, I think we're seeing something similar, where people who've been um, quiet but scared are remain scared, but I've been given a permission slip to speak out. This happens on all political, from different political points of view. The rise of conservatism in the United States,
Mm,
the brilliant term "the silent majority" by Richard
mm,
Nixon, was
mm,
basically trying to give a permission slip, saying that what you have in your mind, a lot of people do. You don't have to be silent anymore, and that can create a self-fulfilling prophecy. With respect to other changes, we've talked a bit about uh, preference falsification and overcoming it. With respect to other changes in norms, it's not about people suddenly feeling licensed to say what they had formerly thought. It's that what they formerly thought shifts by virtue of learning or by virtue of pure social influence. So, recycling behavior, let's say, or other environmentally friendly behavior, buying organic, let's say,
mm,
or becoming more interested in animal welfare. Uh, that's in most cases not a matter of people feeling licensed to do what they had always wanted to do. It's that there's a genuine shift as a result of either information from the statements and actions of other people or reputational pressure, where what was once a tax on behavior, effectively, meaning you wear a mask, maybe you're a criminal or maybe you're sick,
mm,
becomes a subsidy to behavior. You're wearing a mask. Good, you're a good person.
mhm,
And that
mhm.
can sometimes lead to very quick shifts. Think, for example, of seatbelt buckling, where not terribly long ago, the norm was not to buckle. And if you buckled, you were saying either, I think you're a terrible driver,
Mhm,
I'm a terrified person. And neither of those was a very good thing to signal. And now, if you buckle your seatbelts, you're just doing what the norm is.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, even I can sort of think my own within my own mind and reflect on my own behaviors over the last month with mask wearing. I it seems overnight went from looking at others and drawing maybe wrong conclusions about who they are or what was going on with them when I saw them wearing a mask 2 months ago to wearing a mask myself, and obviously judging those who aren't wearing masks, and it seemed to happen overnight. It's incredible.
It's incredible. I share that exactly. Where, as recently, I think, as 10 days ago, I would go into public spaces without a mask and feel fine and a little bit, very slightly puzzled that people wear masks. And now, when I go in with my mask and I see some people without, and I think, who do they think they are?
Yeah. And you've been studying this stuff for a few decades.
Completely.
It's one of the, I think Kahneman said that even he of all people is not immune to our biases, right? So another lesson in that, I'd say. Um, Question. This is certainly a selfish question. With my collaborators and I, we're working on a paper. It's in sort of the nth stage of peer review, it seems, and a brilliant PhD student out of uh, UC Haas is leading this project. So it's on rituals, and I studied
Oh, great,
rituals
great.
for about 10 years in my PhD. It's what I did my dissertation on, and it's still the work I do, and working with Mike and Francesca and folks like that, and Jane. And we're in this debate actually with some of the reviewers on norm versus ritual, and we're taking the stance, and we have a couple studies to preliminary data to support the idea that yes, there's some overlap between rituals and norms, but there's also some unique variance being accounted for in driving, say, moral outrage or anger when people violate certain ritualistic behavior. And the reviewers are coming back and saying quite strongly, rituals are merely a subset of norms. So I don't get very many opportunities to pick the brain of Cass Sunstein. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on
Well, I think
that.
evidently you're the expert on this, and I'm a occasional discussant on rituals and norms. I think offhand, correct me if this sounds way off, that there are some rituals people do who's who, when you don't do them, there isn't a social sanction. So there are people who, before they go to sleep, they have a ritual, and that's ordinary language. Or there are families and communities that have rituals, meaning this is what they do. It might involve, something really small that isn't uh, normatively invested, such that if you don't do it, you look like you're violating a taboo of some kind.
Mhm.
So, in ordinary language, I think in much of literature, a norm is like a soft taboo, or a taboo is the end of the continuum on which many norms that are short of taboos also fall.
Mhm.
But people, you might have a ritual that before you go to sleep, you watch a certain kind of television, silly television.
Mhm.
Am I speaking personally? Maybe. People watch silly television, or when they wake up in the morning, they have a ritual with respect to, you know, food and cleanliness. And we wouldn't say that that's a norm. I wonder if whether the context where your paper, you know, has landed, uh, not engaging in the ritual would be like violating a norm.
Yeah, and that's what we see. And what you're also, you're sort of drawing this important distinction, and there's some other work, drawing a blank on the names of these people, but for listeners, I'll find the paper and put it in the show notes, where they do draw this important distinction between individual ritual versus collective ritual. um and those behave very, very differently. And there's just sort of the injunctive properties associated with them, if you do them right or if you don't do them right, is wildly different if it's a personalized or an individual ritual, or even one that's sort of like held within a family unit versus one that's collective as part of a religious or cultural tribe or group. So it's sort of a jingle jangle problem where we're calling them, we're referring to those behaviors as ritual, but they might actually be quite different
Yes.
phenomena.
It might be. So, offhand, this is something in response to the reviewers that could be sorted out. It's a semantic question.
Mm.
Sometimes people get very excited about semantic questions.
Yeah. Yeah, especially social psychologists. We can waste many hours going back and forth on matters of semantics.
Lawyers,
Um, yeah, so lawyers, I said, yeah, I can imagine. So one final question, if you don't mind. It's called the BBB, or the Big Behavioral Brainstorm. Ask all the guests on the show at the end. So there's a lot of problems in our world today. Which one, if you had to choose just one, do you think could stand to gain from a behavioral type intervention?
poverty. And I say that for two reasons. One is the magnitude of the problem, and the other is the opportunity for help. Where the problem of poverty all over the world has to do often with what Shafir and Mullainathan describe as cognitive scarcity,
Hmm.
and that has an assortment of implications for what private and public institutions should do to help. So if you're poor, the number of things that you can attend to typically in a day isn't as high as if you have resources. So it's a little like a bandwidth problem, and we could do so much. And right now, some governments are going in this direction, just by focusing on the bandwidth problem that is faced by people who are poor, to make opportunities and education and money uh, readily available when they are right now formally available, but not readily available.
Hmm. Hmm. That's great, and that's a just as somebody who has a partner in that world. My wife does work in that space. It's a piece of the conversation that doesn't come up often on the sort of practitioner or the policy side, at least from my view. So I'm glad to hear you see that as something that needs to be discussed among people. Well, Cass, this has been great. I've kept you over time. I promised I'd keep you, and really appreciate it. I think I got to 10% of my my notes.
I really enjoyed it. These are fantastic questions, so I thank you.
Cheers.
Okay, all the best. Yeah, bye.
Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in the episode can be found on the BS podcast page of The Behaviorist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting, easy-to-apply, sciencey stuff. Just go to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. And lastly, if you'd like to join me in the mission of spreading the good BS word, remember to rate and review the show on iTunes. Why should you? Because 1, you're a part of a digital-wide social proof exercise. 2, you're helping combat the negativity bias in the form of positive reviews. And 3, it's a little pre-commitment for your habitual podcast listening. A little investment to keep you coming back for more BS. I mean, how much more behavioral can you get? Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.